I want to present some of the findings of this latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment, because, you know, this has been like 4.5 years' work by about 2,000 scientists around the world. So, the idea of it is that the governments and the community have got some solid science they can kind of turn to and lean on about this issue. And then I wanted to say, give a kind of overview of what some of the main findings were for Australia, and in particular, and then talk about what that means in terms of the agricultural sector for Australia, and then say something about this issue of, well, how can we manage those impacts and future risks? And that's what, that's what we mean by adaptation. I think the good news for the agricultural sector is it's always had to deal with natural climatic variability, and because of the nature of the sector, it's inherently adaptive. Right? It's always having to deal with pressures and changes of one kind or another, new pests or weeds or nematodes or whatever, and Australia, as a continent, is always, naturally has high climatic variability in terms of rainfall and temperature and extremes. So what we're really talking about is how what we're doing in putting up more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is this human influence on the global climate system. So there's a natural variability, and then we're if you like, further forcing more variability on top of that natural stuff. So, next slide. So IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and these reports are done by they're done independently of governments, but they are reports to governments, and they are accepted by governments. And the methodology is, it's not doing new research, it's assessing what research has been done and has been published, mainly in peer-reviewed scientific journals, but also authoritative reports by organisations like the CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology, who regularly issue their own reports. Obviously, if the research hasn't been done, it hasn't been published, and we can't assess it and report on it. So just because something isn't raised or commented on in an IPCC report doesn't mean it's not happening. There's actually a lot of stuff happening which people are experiencing, which the science hasn't caught up with. And I think that's particularly true in the agricultural sector, where people, in those sectors which are very, if you like, exposed and sensitive to weather conditions, they're often experiencing things that aren't, the science is often years behind, what's actually happening. Next slide. So this is just saying there's kind of two reports. Well, there's actually, it's even more complicated. There's the work split up into three working groups. Working group one looks at how is the climate changing, and how do we know which part of that change is due to human influence and which is natural variability. And that's working group one, and they have their own report which details all of that science. And their big conclusion is it's now unequivocal that humans are influencing climate change. I was in working group two, which looks at the impacts of a changing climate, observed impacts and projected impacts, the vulnerability of our human systems, our different sectors and natural systems, ecosystems, to those impacts and projected changes, and adaptation. What are we doing about it, and what can we do about it to manage those impacts and risks? Our report was 3,600 pages long. It had 270 authors from 67 countries. We assessed 34,000 scientific publications, and there are three drafts of it which are it's an open peer-reviewed process. Any expert can register. Government experts are all assess it, and there were 62,500 review comments posted, and we have to write a response to every one, and it's all logged in a spreadsheet which is publicly available. So it's a very transparent, thorough process. All of that technical, and for historic reasons, in Australia and New Zealand get their own regional chapter. it's because of how the UN organised the world 40 years ago. They haven't updated the regionalisation. Yeah. And it's called Australasia. I mean, Anyway, so we have a whole chapter, 100 pages long, which assessed updating what science has found about impacts, vulnerability and adaptation for Australia and New Zealand. It's an interesting process. That is all, and that's really technical stuff, very detailed. That's all translated into a 35-page kind of executive summary with high-level statements, which is called a summary for policy makers, isn't it, or decision makers, policy makers, which is translating all of that into, I wouldn't say plain English, but it's meant to be for government officials for governments and government people, and that document is actually drafted by the scientists, and then over a 2-week period in a big kind of plenary session, the government representatives debate, analyse every word and every sentence, and to challenge whether how that kind of more plain English statement, what's the science supporting it, and so at the end of that process, the governments accept the full report, accept the summary report, and in doing that, accept the full report. So I'm kind of explaining the process at length because it took 4.5 years. That process took 4.5 years, and it's like it's a big job. And so the previous government, we had the Morrison government, fully accepted this science, right? It was fully accepted by the Australian government. Anyway, next slide. Anyway, we can go on. So this is kind of the main finding, one of the main findings that came out of that first group's report, is that we're currently experiencing the impacts from this index we call global warming above pre-industrial levels, which is about 1850 when we started to burn coal for fossil fuel. So I'm going to explain what the significance of that is, but we're currently experiencing 1.1 degree global warming. So climate change isn't something that's going to happen, it's happened. We're now experiencing the climate, global climate has changed significantly, and we're experiencing the impacts from it. And there's about another 0.4 degrees global warming locked in. So we will hit 1.5 degrees of global warming somewhere between 2030 to 2040. What happens beyond that depends upon, the world community's success or failure to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what these different coloured lines show over time, up to 2100, different levels of global warming. It's still possible, it's still physically possible, technically possible, to limit global warming to that 1.5 degrees. We're currently heading more towards, up around here. And current policies would put us around closer to around 2.5 to 3 degrees. If people were to be a bit more ambitious, in the lack of any more ambition, that we're going to end up somewhere here. So, and the point being that the impacts and the risks increase with every increment of global warming. And I just want to explain this next slide, 1 point why. Next slide. Okay, so people often say 1.1 degree of warming, why worry? Or 2 degrees of warming, why worry? Well, the way to think of it is, it's just an index, and it's analogous to your body temperature your GP takes when they put a thermometer under your tongue or wherever else they put thermometers these days. So we know that with the human body, a safe average body temperature is between 36 to 37 degrees Celsius. 38 degrees, indicates you've got a fever, and above 40 degrees, it's life-threatening. Well, that's kind of what we're talking about when we've got this index of, the average surface temperature of Earth compared to what it was in 1850. A healthy temperature is 0, right? and we're now at 1.1. The science is telling us we're at 1.1. Well, you could say that's equivalent of a fever, I mean, by analogy, by a metaphor, and above 1.5 degrees is, kind of equivalent of life-threatening. So every increment of warning, every 0.1, represents a massive amount of change in Earth's climate, is the point. So it doesn't mean, great, it's going to be 8 rather than 9, next. Like it's not talking about the daily temperature. It's just an index of how much change there is in the Earth system. So one really, I guess one of the key, if not the key point I'm trying to make today is that it's important to understand the difference between a change in what we call climate trends and a change in climate extremes, and then the connection between trends and extremes. So what do I mean by trends? Well, this is what we've found, and it's no surprise. Of course, we're all experiencing it. There's further warming everywhere. Everywhere in Australia is getting hotter, where maximum daily temperatures are increasing, mean daily temperatures are increasing, minimum temperatures are increasing. And that's happening everywhere in Australia. It's actually happening faster, it's getting hotter quicker in higher country. We're also getting ongoing sea level rise. That's because actually most of the extra heat in the atmosphere goes to heat, because most of the planet's ocean, 70% of its ocean, as you heat water, it expands. I mean, it's kind of that simple. We're getting less snow. Now, rainfall is really complicated. Temperature is very uniformly getting warmer, but rainfall, this is where the word disruption comes in. I would say it's better to think of rainfall as being disrupted. We're actually getting more rainfall in North Australia and less in the southwest, south and southeast in April to October. I'll explain that a bit more, so just go to the next slide. So this just shows the change in temperature. This is the observed change in temperature. This is not modelled, it's not a prediction. Since 1960, comparing 1960 to 2019, and that's Australia and that's New Zealand. That is all of Australia's average surface temperature, and you can see the upward trend. But this shows that there's variability, there's geographic variability, but everywhere is getting hotter. Some places are just getting hotter quicker than others. But if we go to rainfall, we've split this into two because we've got kind of summer at the top and winter at the bottom, and Northern Australia's whited out because it doesn't get any rain in winter, it's generally anyway. But you can see that it's highly variable seasonally, and it's highly variable geographically. So, southwest southwest Western Australia has a long-term decline in total rainfall. They mainly get their rainfall in winter. It's very much a winter rainfall zone, and there's probably 20% decrease now in rain. And we also see up around where we are, there's also a decline in winter rainfall as well. So the temperature is getting hotter everywhere, but the rainfall, the total amount of rainfall isn't really changing. That's what this graph is showing. There's a bit of a rise, but it's down. If anything, the total rainfall is increasing across the whole continent in aggregate, but regionally the seasonal patterns are being highly disrupted and they're changing. And that's a very consistent trend, across country. So next slide. And there are some parts of Australia where these climate trends are having a big impact in agriculture, and the most obvious one is the Murray-Darling Basin, which has seen this major decline, 15 to 20% in winter rainfall, and hence, plus there's already, that's on top of what one could argue is a lot of mismanagement of water resources and a lot of, more water is allocated than what there is anyway. And on top of that, there's this trend of declining rainfall. So this is a big challenge for the Murray-Darling Basin and their water plan. And it's actually, the impact of recent droughts and these trends are projected to continue. Drying trends is projected to continue. It has accelerated a lot of, water reform in the basin. I mean, people know about this and have for some years now. But, it's an escalating challenge. There's increased demand for water and there's less water and there's going to be less water.
Mike, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Like the previous slide,
yeah.
we're up to, with the temperature change, was up to 1990 in Australia. So are we already over 1.5?
Australia is actually, if you look at our continent, we're at about, on average, it's more than 1.1. It's about 1.4. But again, it's a global index, right? So, I know, but it's, but yeah. So Australia is warming faster than the global average. Yeah, that's true. But some parts of the world are like in the the northern, like North Alaska or those places, Greenland, they're like 4 degrees rather than 1.1 or 6 degrees. Higher elevation and higher latitude countries are warming faster. But yeah, Australia's warming faster than the global average. Next one. And so these were I've just pulled out here some of the assessment statements from the Australian chapter. And again, this is what's been reported in the scientific literature. The seasonality and annual production of pasture is changing. So if you think about increasing heat and disrupted rainfall patterns, that's all understandable. Droughts are causing a lot of economic damage to livestock enterprises, with drought and market prices significantly affecting profit. In addition to impacts on health and on animal health and livelihood and pastoralists, periods of drought contribute to land degradation, particularly in the cattle regions of northern Australia. Heat loads in cattle leads to reduce growth rates and reproduction. Extreme heat waves can lead to death. Temperatures over 32 degrees reduce ewe and ram fertility along with the birth weight of lambs. So that's some of the observed reported impacts of climate change in the agricultural sector. Projected, again, it's when you look at the disruption to rainfall, some areas may experience increased pasture growth, others may experience a decrease. In eastern parts of Queensland, climate change impacts on pasture growth are equivocal, which means we're not sure whether it will increase or decrease. And a lot of this has got to do with, it's very difficult to predict at a local level what's going to happen to rainfall patterns. And rainfall's such a major driver of productivity. Next slide. But there's more, and these changes in trends have actually also driven a change in climatic extremes, and it's this change in the frequency and/or intensity and/or duration of all extreme weather events that probably has had and will have the biggest impact on the agricultural sector, both I think cropping and livestock, both directly and indirectly. So we've seen this with everything. There's been an increase in danger in dangerous fire weather conditions and fire rate and bushfires. There's been changes in flooding regimes, in heat waves, in droughts. Tropical cyclones, there's not been an increase in tropical cyclones. There's actually probably been fewer, but they're more intense. So the South Pacific's getting Category 5 cyclones, which they had never got previously. And up until now, or up until recently, the last 7 years, I guess, the science hasn't been able to, scientifically, if you like, connect the human influence in the climate trends with changes in the extreme events. But that's now changed. It's called attribution science. There's now very good science about how we can say how much of a extreme weather event is due to human-influenced climate change. You know, how much more likely it was. It's often expressed as, how much more likely it was, or because of human-influenced climate change, or how much more likely it is to happen in the future because of that. And the reasons for it are complicated. We all know about La Nina and El Nino, right? That cycle which can bring us really dry conditions or really wet conditions. Well, there's another one in the Indian Ocean called the Indian Ocean Dipole, and there's one down the south called the Southern Oscillation, and all three of them can interact. They can be in sync or out of sync. And all of those systems are being intensified by human-influenced climate change. So the climate trends are actually, if you like, turning up the knobs, turning up the volumes on those weather systems, and that's a major reason why we're getting an increase in the frequency and duration and severity of all these extreme weather events here. Next slide. And again, this was in our report, and this is all research that was done before the floods we've been experiencing. And this is particularly since the 1970s, there's been an increase. As I said, there has not been an increase, or a little bit of an increase in total rainfall, but it's actually an increase in extreme high rainfall, heavy rainfall events. So heavy rainfall events have become more frequent and they've become heavier. And that trend is projected to increase. So this brings increased fluvial and fluvial flood risk, which obviously, as we all know, has a lot of consequences. I mean, it's got direct impacts on agriculture, but it's also all these indirect impacts, the disruption to transportation and communication and supply networks and things like this. So, I would call that indirect impact on agriculture, if you like. Next slide. And again, this was a major finding from our report, which all came out before all of these things happen, is that the extreme events, because they're happening at a larger scale and more frequency, they're having cascading impacts, across sectors, and they're also compounding because they're running into each other or overlapping with each other. I mean, we've seen this here, with the bushfires and the floods, and even going back a few years, far north Queensland had the same thing. They had unprecedented catastrophic bushfires where in forests that had never burned, immediately followed by unprecedented flooding. And the capacity of all the systems, human systems, to manage that and respond to that were just completely overwhelmed. And again, it's just worth understanding why the bushfires are worsening, because so the human influence climate change has lengthened the fire season and it's driving more extreme fire weather. So fire weather is a function of the drought in the preceding season, which is here for Australia, well, eastern and southern Australia, it's really the winter, how deep the winter drought is, because that determines how dry all the biomass is, all the vegetation is. So when you have a really deep drought, as we had a couple of years ago, there was just no moisture anywhere. All the vegetation was highly flammable at unprecedented levels. And then we had heat waves in September, so really high temperatures. And again, that's a climate change effect. And then on the day you have low humidity, and then you have a big wind. You've got dangerous fire weather conditions. And that's what we saw happen, 2 years ago. Very deep drought, and then really hot early spring. Next slide. And I've already said this, but these impacts are compounding and aggregating. the droughts and the floods and the fires and the heat waves are happening in the same regions more often and more frequently, so we don't recover from one before the other comes, and so that's the disruption. That's where the disruption term is, I think very relevant. And our, the next slide. So again, in our report, in terms of what was reported in the literature, there was studies done looking at how heavy rainfalls and storms affect erosion, particularly in extensively grazed systems or on steep country, and how this can affect longer term productivity. There's a lot of studies done on heat stress in livestock in terms of reproduction rates and milk production, and projections about how the number of heat stress days for livestock are projected to increase in the coming decades. Next slide. This is these maps come from the New South Wales Government adaptation website, climate website, and New South Wales has got, in addition to these kind of scientific models of the global climate, there are also regional models, which the global models don't take into account local factors like mountain ranges and rain shadow effects and distance from the coast and those kind of localised factors, because they're very coarse. So there are, a subset which are called dynamically downscale regional climate models, which it's actually the same models that Bureau of Meteorology uses to forecast the weather, but each state government now has, funds a university to run these and calibrate them for their state. And I think it's Professor Andy Pittman at UNSW runs the one for New South Wales. And these give much more accurate regional projections. So this is just some projections of, I think that's a change in number of days a year where the maximum temperature is greater than 35 degrees, projected for 2080. And this is change in winter rainfall as a percent against a kind of current baseline by 2080. So again, it's kind of showing everywhere is going to have more heat wave days. Of course, the closer you are to the coast, the more the temperature's moderated, which is a good thing. The further inland you are, the more extremes they are. But again, this pattern just shows, the brown just shows there's still this ongoing projected trend of decreasing winter rainfall. Not in summer. If I were to show the map for summer, there's probably a bit of an increase in summer rainfall, right? But again, that's just a percentage change. It's not telling you how that rainfall will come in summer. It could all come in one day, right, or a week or something. But, is that significant for the Tweed, for agriculture? I don't know. How important is winter rainfall? I mean, leaving aside the indirect impacts on bushfire danger, is that important for agriculture or not? That's.
Definitely, the cropping and even the cane.
Right.
Needs the weather at the right time to get at the wrong time to work.
Yeah. So next slide. Oh, these are very complicated maps. I won't bother with them. So, adaptation, and again, I just stress this point, and actually that was the point of the previous slide, was that if you compare the impacts and risks on different sectors, and those graphs were kind of showing, well, if we have different levels of global warming, like if we get to 2 degrees, what's the adaptive capacity in a different sector to manage that risk? So there are some, like natural systems, which are highly climate sensitive. Tropical coral reefs, right? They're really sensitive to marine heat waves and this coral bleaching effect, and there's not much you can do about it. But the agricultural sector, as I said, is quite different. It's built on being adaptive and nimble and having to accommodate changing markets and weather conditions and all of this. So, so here on these graphs we show, the disruption. This is trying to illustrate that the agricultural sector has a lot of adaptive capacity to deal with kind of climate disruption compared to how you're trying to manage the Great Barrier Reef for tourism, where once you get above 1.5 degrees, there's nothing really you can do about the coral bleaching. And the same with heat-related deaths. There's a lot you can... The biggest cause of death, human death in Australia from climate events is heat waves. It always has been. But there's a lot you can do to adapt to reduce that. There's a lot we should be doing irrespective of climate change. Particularly, because there's vulnerable people, there's elderly people, there's people in poor housing, there's the sick, etc. And this is a big issue for outdoor workers as well. But there's a lot you can do to manage that. These were just some of the messages that came out just to illustrate adaptation in both grazing and confined beef cattle systems requires enhanced decision-making skills capable of integrated biophysical, social, economic considerations. It's kind of a motherhood statement. You kind of all know that, and it's why you're all here, I guess. But and the importance of social learning networks, such as what you're doing here. But there's other things people are looking at. To counter the drying trends, using more deeply rooted pasture species, drought-tolerant species, etc. Maybe altering the breeding calendar to deal with heat stress, etc. So, it's just illustrating that there's a lot of options in the agricultural sector for managing specific climate-related risks related to these direct impacts of extremes, on the farming system. But I think it's the indirect impacts on agriculture which we also have to be thinking about, and this is where this concept of disruption, it's disruption to all those networks that farms are dependent upon, right? The transportation, the communication, the distributions, the supplies, etc. That's not something that an individual farming enterprise can do. It requires collective action and a lot of coordinated activity through different levels of government. And I guess you're all reading carefully the latest report from the New South Wales one, which was interesting. And this slide was just some of our general comments about adaptation, that the scale and scope of cascading, compounding aggregate impacts require new, large-scale and more timely adaptation. And I think in the agricultural sector, this just gets back, in a region like the Tweed, gets back to, and this is a question for all sectors, is how do you, if we're going to have these major kind of disruptions due to more extreme events, how do we maintain the connectivity of our networks that we're all embedded within and dependent upon? So that's one aspect of adaptation. And the other is these direct impacts, heat stress, dealing with, if you're cropping, dealing with less rain, if you've got cattle, dealing with heat stress. So there's kind of two areas of adaptation that are relevant here, I think. And we have this, we use this phrase, a shift to transformative and proactive adaptation. It just means getting on the front foot about it a bit more. So I think that's my last slide. It is.
That is, Brendan.
Okay, so thank you. Okay.